What happens when freedom is reduced to nothing more than a dream behind barbed wire? For generations, filmmakers have turned those desperate moments of captivity into gripping stories of wit, courage, and sometimes sheer luck. These aren't the glossy blockbusters you've heard about 1,000 times. They're the overlooked escape tales, the ones that slip through the cracks of movie history. And some of them come with twists so bold, you'll wonder why they've been kept in the shadows all this time. Danger Within, 1959. A prison camp drama with a detective's heartbeat. At first glance, Danger Within looked like another British war picture, stiff uniforms and clipped accents included. But beneath its polite surface lurked something stranger. Set in an Italian prisoner camp, the story wasn't just about digging out or slipping past guards. It was about a hidden killer in the barracks. Imagine being trapped plotting escape while realizing one of your own might be silently eliminating comrades. That chilling mix of suspense and claustrophobia gave the film a tone unlike anything audiences were expecting. Based on Michael Gilbert's novel, the movie leaned more toward mystery than patriotic cheer. Instead of cheering heroes with rousing speeches, you got officers staring at each other with suspicion, every handshake laced with doubt. It was part war film, part Agatha Christie thriller. The tension wasn't only at the fences, but inside the minds of the prisoners themselves. Could they still trust each other long enough to dig a tunnel? Or would paranoia crack the group before they even reached the wire? Critics of the day admired the risk, praising its eerie mood and the way it refused to offer easy answers. But general audiences weren't sure what to make of it. Without Hollywood star power or flashy marketing, it slipped quietly away, overshadowed by cheerier tales of Allied pluck. Yet today, film historians see it differently. They call it a precursor to the psychological thrillers that would dominate decades later. The real power of Danger Within is that it reminds us, sometimes, the worst cage isn't made of steel. It's the invisible one built from mistrust. Escaping that? Far harder than digging through dirt. The Wooden Horse, 1950. Sometimes the simplest tricks are the boldest. Released just 5 years after the end of the war, The Wooden Horse brought a fresh wound to the screen. It told the true story of a breakout from Stalag Luft III, the same camp that would later inspire The Great Escape. But unlike Hollywood's large-scale spectacle, this was stripped down raw and incredibly clever. The method? Ingenious in its simplicity. Prisoners built a hollow wooden vaulting horse. Every day they carried it into the yard for exercise. While some men jumped and tumbled over the horse in full view of German guards, others, inside the wooden shell, quietly dug a tunnel beneath. It was theater as survival, a daring performance staged under the enemy's nose. And it worked. Bit by bit, day by day, freedom grew beneath their feet. What set the film apart was its insistence on authenticity. Actual veterans advised the production, making sure no Hollywood sheen smoothed over the gritty details. Instead of swelling orchestras or heroic one-liners, the camera lingered on sweat, effort, and silence. The suspense came not from explosions, but from the unbearable tension of being watched every second. Audiences in Britain respected its restraint. Many saw it as a dignified memorial to ingenuity and patience. Across the Atlantic, though it made barely a ripple, without big stars or cinematic fireworks, American audiences overlooked it. And yet, in hindsight, its quiet honesty hits harder than many louder films that followed. Because here's the truth. Escape isn't always about daring motorcycle rides or fiery showdowns. Sometimes it's about patience routine and keeping a straight face while lying to the people staring directly at you. The Wooden Horse proves that the smallest stories can sometimes carry the heaviest weight. The Colditz Story, 1955. Escape-proof? Not quite. Colditz Castle, perched on a hill in Germany, was meant to be the final stop for any Allied officer with escape written in his blood. The Nazis considered it inescapable. To be sent there was almost an insult. We know you'll try again, so here's the toughest lock and the thickest key. But in the Colditz Story, director Guy Hamilton proved that no prison is truly secure when human imagination is the weapon of choice. Adapted from Pat Reed's memoir, the film played it straight, resisting the temptation to Hollywoodize the events. Instead, it leaned on authenticity. Forged documents, painstakingly crafted uniforms sewn in secret, and rehearsed accents practiced in whispers. It wasn't about explosions or bravado. It was about patience, cunning, and nerve. The suspense didn't come from action sequences, but from the moments before a pause at the gate, a glance too long from a guard, the sound of boots echoing in a corridor. What made the film eerie was where it was shot. Much of it was filmed at the actual Colditz Castle, the same fortress where real men had risked everything to get out. Cast and crew described an atmosphere that felt heavy, as if the stone walls still held onto the whispers of the past. That sense of history clung to the movie and gave it a weight beyond its modest budget. British audiences embraced it, seeing in its grit a reflection of their own wartime endurance. Overseas, it failed to capture the same attention. American audiences wanted spectacle, not subtlety. And so it slipped into history's shadows, remembered by enthusiasts but overshadowed by louder, flashier escape tales. Today, revisiting the Colditz story feels like uncovering a time capsule. It isn't polished, it isn't grand, but it captures something few films dare, the belief that even the strongest fortress has cracks. And those cracks belong to the human will. Stalag 17, 1953. Cynicism in the barracks. Before audiences were swept up by the heroic camaraderie of the Great Escape, Billy Wilder brought them something darker, Stalag 17. It wasn't filled with noble speeches or patriotic unity. It was laced with gallows humor, selfish schemes, and a deep suspicion that survival could turn any man into a deal-maker. At the heart of it all stood William Holden as Sergeant J.J. Sefton, a character audiences didn't know how to feel about. He traded with guards, hoarded cigarettes, and made no secret of caring only about himself. When an escape attempt went horribly wrong, suspicion turned squarely toward him. Was Sefton a traitor, feeding information to the enemy? Or was he just too clever for his own good? Wilder, who had fled Europe and lost family to the war, brought a sharp edge to the film. He didn't romanticize the camp experience, he exposed it. Prisoners weren't saints. They bickered, connived, and joked about misery. The barracks felt less like a band of brothers, and more like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Humor mingled with despair in a way that unsettled audiences at the time. Behind the scenes, Wilder fought to protect this tone. Holden himself nearly turned down the role, fearing audiences would despise Sefton. Instead, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor, proving that a flawed hero could still command respect. Stalag 17 wasn't about tunneling under fences or outwitting guards with daring stunts. Its real drama came from paranoia, the sense that your worst enemy might be sitting on the bunk right next to you. That twist made it unique then and keeps it biting today. It asked a hard question. When survival is on the line, do ideals still matter? Or does the will to live make everyone suspect? Von Ryan's Express, 1965. Sinatra, on the run, but not the way you expect. By the mid-60s, audiences thought they knew what a Hollywood escape film looked like. Brave men, noble speeches, a triumphant dash into the sunset. Then along came Von Ryan's Express, starring none other than Frank Sinatra, and tore that template apart. Sinatra played Colonel Joseph Ryan, an American airman who found himself in an Italian POW camp alongside wary British prisoners. From the start, Ryan was no square-jawed war hero. He was pragmatic, unsentimental, even selfish at times. Instead of inspiring trust, he clashed with fellow prisoners, ignored traditions, and looked out for number one. Critics and fans were stunned. Could a man so flawed really lead an escape? The story grew bolder from there. The escape wasn't just a tunnel in the dirt, it was a full-blown attempt to steal a German train and race through occupied Italy, while enemy troops closed in from every side. Director Mark Robson balanced grit with spectacle, staging sweeping shots of locomotives barreling down tracks as desperate prisoners fought to stay ahead. But here's the kicker. Von Ryan's Express didn't deliver the usual Hollywood payoff. Without spoiling too much, let's just say Sinatra's character doesn't get the neat bow audiences were expecting. The ending was tragic, defiant, and unforgettable. It turned what could have been a glossy adventure into something sharper, something that stuck in your throat. Audiences loved the thrill of it, and the film became a box office success. But its darker notes meant it wasn't the comfort watch other war films became. Today, it stands out for daring to ask a question most war movies avoided. What if escape doesn't end in glory? What if freedom itself comes at a crushing cost? The Mackenzie Break, 1970. The tables finally turn. By the 70s, audiences had seen plenty of Allied escape movies. But the Mackenzie Break dared to flip the script. This time, the escape artists weren't British or American heroes at all. They were German prisoners locked up in a Scottish camp led by a calculating officer who simply refused to admit the war was lost. Helmut Grimm played Captain Willi Schluter, a man as charming as he was ruthless. To him, captivity wasn't an end, but another battlefield. He rallied his men, forged documents, and plotted one of the most audacious escapes ever imagined, slipping out of Scotland to meet a German submarine off the coast. Suddenly, the line between villain and hero blurred. Could you admire the cunning of an enemy even as you despised his cause? On the other side stood Brian Keith as Captain Connor, an Irish intelligence officer brought in to stop the chaos. What followed was less a war story and more a tense chess match. Every move, smuggling maps, staging distractions, hiding tools, was met with a countermove. It was brains versus brains, each man testing the other's resolve. At the time, critics weren't quite sure what to do with it. Showing German POWs as intelligent, resourceful, even sympathetic in moments, challenged the simple good versus evil formula audiences had grown used to. But that was exactly what made it stick. It asked viewers to wrestle with uncomfortable truths. Both sides of the war were filled with men desperate to escape, and not all escapes were about survival. Some were about continuing the fight. The submarine climax was tense, tragic, and morally gray. Were we supposed to cheer their daring or recoil at their loyalty? That question lingers long after the credits roll. The Mackenzie Break remains one of the rare war films that reminds us escape wasn't just an Allied fantasy, it was a human obsession no matter which side of the wire you stood on. King Rat, 1965. Escape without tunnels. Escape without fences. Escape without heroes. That's what King Rat delivered, and it shocked audiences expecting another tale of camaraderie and ingenuity. Instead, they got a slow, suffocating look at survival in a Japanese prisoner camp in Singapore. Based on James Clavell's own novel, Clavell himself was a former POW. The story centered on Corporal King, played by George Segal. Unlike most camp dramas, King wasn't noble or selfless. He thrived by bending rules, trading with guards, and running a black market while fellow prisoners withered from disease and hunger. To some, he was a parasite. To others, he was a lifeline. The movie asked a ruthless question. When starvation and despair set in, does morality matter, or does survival belong only to the cunning? British officers clung to ideals of honor and discipline, but King lived by different rules. He proved that in the harshest conditions, power didn't come from stripes on a uniform. It came from food favors and nerve. Director Brian Forbes kept the atmosphere unrelenting. No swelling music, no speeches of defiance, only silence bargaining, and the sound of misery pressing down on everyone. Viewers split down the middle. Some praised its honesty, others recoiled at its lack of heroism. Segal's performance captured this perfectly. Magnetic and unsettling, impossible to dismiss, but hard to admire. King Rat isn't a film about escaping walls. It's about escaping despair. It strips away the fantasy that captivity builds only unity. Instead, it shows that captivity tests every shred of humanity you have left. For some, that truth was too much. But for others, it was exactly the reminder that not all prisons are broken with shovels. Some are broken with sheer willpower and a willingness to cross moral lines most people never would. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, 1983. A war film with David Bowie and a haunting piano theme? Yes, it happened. And it turned into one of the most unusual prisoner of war movies ever made. Directed by Japanese auteur Nagisa Oshima, Merry Christmas. Mr. Lawrence set itself apart immediately by refusing to follow the usual blueprint of tunnels and daring breakouts. Instead, it explored the psychological battlefields inside a Japanese POW camp during World War II. The film's core was the strange magnetic connection between Major Jack Selliers, played by Bowie, and Captain Yonoi, portrayed by Japanese musician-actor Ryuichi Sakamoto. Their relationship wasn't about escapes or victories, but about obsession, admiration, and power. Yonoi both admired and despised Selliers, seeing in him a kind of freedom he could never admit to himself. The result was a tension that simmered through every scene. Tom Conti's Lieutenant Lawrence acted as the bridge between cultures, interpreting, mediating, and sometimes simply enduring. His presence gave the film its grounding, while the clashes between Bowie's restrained melancholy and Sakamoto's rigid intensity pushed the story into territory war films rarely dared explore. The soundtrack composed by Sakamoto became legendary. That single haunting piano melody still echoes in film history as one of the great cinematic themes. Sorrowful longing, unforgettable. Audiences didn't quite know what to make of it at first. Some critics found it too slow, too abstract, too ambiguous. Others called it profound, praising its willingness to explore identity repression and the blurred lines between captor and captive. What everyone agreed on was Bowie's performance. At the height of his stardom, he disappeared into a role that was fragile, tragic, and far removed from his glittering stage persona. Merry Christmas. Mr. Lawrence wasn't about fences or barbed wire. It was about the prisons we carry inside ourselves. For some, that made it confusing. For others, it made it unforgettable. The Hill, 1965. Sean Connery stripped of his Bond charm, climbing a mound of sand until he breaks. That's The Hill. And it's not your typical prisoner of war film. Instead of Allied soldiers behind German wire, Sidney Lumet turned the lens on British soldiers locked up by their own side in a North African military prison. That twist alone shattered the formula. The story follows a group of men sentenced for insubordination, forced into brutal discipline under the merciless eye of their wardens. Their punishment wasn't shackles or guard towers. It was the Hill, a towering mound of sand they were ordered to climb over and over under a blistering sun. No escape tunnels, no daring disguises, just exhaustion, humiliation, and cruelty dressed up as military order. Connery, fresh off Bond fame, shocked audiences by throwing away the tuxedo and gadgets. He played a soldier stripped down to raw humanity, angry, desperate, and vulnerable. Harry Andrews, as the sadistic regimental sergeant major, gave one of the coldest performances in prison film history. The clash between Connery's broken defiance and Andrews' iron discipline was the beating heart of the film. Lumet shot in stark black and white, leaving no room for glamour. Sweat poured muscles, strained, and every scream echoed in the desert air. Watching it was an endurance test almost as punishing for the audience as for the characters. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece of intensity. But for casual moviegoers looking for heroics, it was too raw, too bleak. What sets The Hill apart is its theme. The enemy wasn't across the battlefield. The enemy was within the same uniform. Escape here wasn't about breaking out of barbed wire. It was about breaking out from the crushing weight of power gone unchecked. That made it one of the most daring anti-establishment war films of its era. La Grande Illusion, 1937. Long before World War II gave us tunnels and wire, Jean Renoir gave us class divisions and compassion. La Grande Illusion isn't just considered one of the greatest war films ever made, it's also one of the first to show captivity, not in terms of good versus evil, but in terms of humanity. Set during World War I, the film follows French officers captured by the Germans. But here's the twist. Instead of cardboard villains, Renoir painted the German commandant, played by Erich von Stroheim, as cultured, weary, and even kind. The film leaned on the irony that aristocratic French officers shared more in common with their German counterparts than with the working-class soldiers supposedly on their side. The escapes themselves weren't about explosions or chase sequences. They were slow, tense, and rooted in the quiet desperation of men dreaming of freedom. But Renoir's real interest was in the bonds between people across lines of nationality and class. A French aristocrat might share a meal with a German officer, while both wondered whether their entire world of titles and privilege was about to collapse. Released in 1937, the film was explosive. It was banned in Nazi Germany, where Joseph Goebbels reportedly labeled it Cinematic Enemy Number 1. Fascist Italy tried to suppress it, and even France banned it briefly because its message was so unsettling. And yet it was celebrated worldwide, hailed by directors like Orson Welles and François Truffaut as one of cinema's masterpieces. The film's message is timeless. Fences may separate men, but the real prisons are illusions of class nationalism and power. Escaping those chains, Renoir suggested, is far harder than crawling through dirt. Escape to Victory, 1981. A POW escape film with Pelé doing a bicycle kick. Yes, that really happened. By the early 80s, war movies felt predictable. Then John Huston decided to toss a soccer ball into the mix. Escape to Victory was half prisoner drama, half sports film, and all kinds of strange. The setup: Allied prisoners are forced by their Nazi captors to play in a propaganda soccer match in occupied Paris. On the surface, it's just a game, but underneath, it's a cover for a daring escape. Leading the prisoners was Michael Caine as the weary captain, with Sylvester Stallone playing an unlikely American goalkeeper. The casting alone raised eyebrows. Alongside the Hollywood stars, actual soccer legends like Pelé and Bobby Moore joined the lineup. For fans, it was surreal. World-famous athletes running across a pitch in the middle of a war movie. And somehow, it worked. Pelé's gravity-defying bicycle kick became one of the most choreographed, memorable sports moments in cinema history. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Stallone, who had never played the game, trained endlessly and still looked out of place beside the pros. Caine himself admitted he could barely run, but the energy of the film carried it through. Audiences in Europe, where soccer is practically religion, loved it. Critics rolled their eyes, but the public turned it into a cult favorite. At its heart, Escape to Victory wasn't really about whether the prisoners got away. It was about the way humans cling to joy, teamwork, and competition, even in the darkest times. Instead of tunnels and disguises, the ball itself became the weapon of defiance. And that strange blend of sport and survival gave the film a lasting legacy as one of the weirdest and most entertaining POW escape stories ever filmed. The Great Escape, 1963. The myth, the legend, the one that swallowed all others. You knew it had to show up here because no list of POW escape films can close without it. But let's be clear, The Great Escape isn't just a movie. It's a cultural monument, the standard by which every prison break story has been judged ever since. Directed by John Sturges and released in the summer of 1963, it brought together one of the most dazzling ensembles ever assembled. Steve McQueen, James Garner, Richard Attenborough, Charles Bronson, and more. The film was based on the real breakout from Stalag Luft III, where Allied prisoners dug 3 elaborate tunnels named Tom, Dick, and Harry. The scope was staggering. Forged papers, handmade disguises, underground air pumps, the sheer ingenuity of it felt like something out of legend. Of course, Hollywood couldn't resist polishing the tale. McQueen's famous motorcycle chase leaping fences on a stolen bike was pure invention. In reality, there was no daredevil ride through the German countryside, but that moment burned into movie history and cemented McQueen as the ultimate rebel cool. Meanwhile, Attenborough's mastermind and Bronson's claustrophobic tunneler grounded the story with grit and humanity. What audiences didn't see was the darkness behind the spectacle. In real life, of the 76 men who crawled out of that camp, only 3 made it home. 50 were executed on Hitler's orders, one of the war's most infamous atrocities. The film softened those details, giving audiences a bittersweet triumph instead of unrelenting tragedy. Yet survivors and families always remembered the true cost. Production itself was a battle. Filming in Germany brought logistical nightmares, egos flared on set, and McQueen even walked off at one point until his role was expanded. But out of that chaos came cinematic magic. The image of McQueen bouncing a baseball in solitary confinement became a symbol of defiance that transcended the movie. 60 years later, The Great Escape still defines the genre. It's thrilling, heartbreaking, and unforgettable. More than that, it's proof that even in cages, human ingenuity can build legends that outlast barbed wire and time itself. So there you have it. 12 prisoner of war escape films that prove freedom isn't just about breaking through fences. Sometimes it's about patience. Sometimes it's about defiance. And sometimes it's about finding humanity in the unlikeliest places. Which of these buried gems caught you by surprise? Drop your pick in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and share this with someone who loves hidden cinema. Because if these films teach us anything, it's that no story and no spirit stays locked up forever.